Zhao Ming never expected to feel so invisible. He stood in the corner of his office, trying to get some work done, though he had no real intention of doing anything productive. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, casting a sickly glow over the dull gray walls. The hum of conversation from his co-workers blurred into the background. He glanced at the clock, 11:43 a.m. His stomach growled, and he wondered if he could sneak out for a coffee break. Maybe, just maybe, if he timed it right, he could stretch that break into a full hour, pretending he'd been in a meeting. Zhao Ming was a 30-something nobody. He had no family, no aspirations, and certainly no exciting plans. He lived alone in a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city, his life a monotonous routine of work, sleep, and the occasional meal at a cheap restaurant. He'd tried to dream once, a long time ago. He'd wanted to be an artist, or a writer, or something that made people look at him and think, wow, there's a man with passion. But somewhere along the way, the passion had drained out of him. The spark was gone, and all that was left was the empty space where his dreams used to be. He was so consumed with his own thoughts that he barely noticed when the email notification pinged on his phone. Unlock the power of your soul. The subject line caught his eye. He wasn't one for chain emails or anything remotely suspicious, but there was something strange about this one. Intrigued, he tapped the message open, and what he saw made him blink in confusion. The email was short, cryptic, and oddly formal. Dear Zhao Ming, have you ever wondered what it would be like to live someone else's life? To experience the world through their eyes? If you accept the invitation, you will be granted the ability to swap souls with anyone, no matter who they are, no matter where they live. You will walk in their shoes, live their life, and taste their experiences. There is a price, of course. All great powers come with sacrifice. But what price would you pay for a life you've never lived? Click here to begin your journey. At the end of the email was a link to a website, something called SoulSwap. Zhao's first instinct was to laugh it off. Probably some weird app that will take all my personal info and sell it to advertisers, he muttered to himself. But there was a voice in the back of his head that urged him to click. He didn't know why. It was like the decision had already been made before he'd even thought it through. He tapped the link. The page that opened was minimalist and stark, the background a deep purple that almost seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. At the top of the page, there was a single button that read, Start your journey. He hesitated. The words on the screen mocked him, promising something beyond his dull existence. He'd never been one to believe in supernatural things. He wasn't gullible. He was a practical man, a man who had learned long ago that the world owed him nothing. Yet, there was something in the simplicity of the page that felt too real to ignore. Without thinking, he clicked the button. Suddenly, his screen went dark, and a chill ran down his spine. For a moment, Zhao thought he'd somehow broken his phone. But then, a strange sensation began to overwhelm him. His vision blurred, his head spun. He felt as if the world itself was shifting beneath him, and then, nothing. He opened his eyes. He was no longer sitting at his desk. Instead, he was standing on a balcony, looking out over a vast cityscape. The sun was setting, casting the world in a warm, golden hue. The wind ruffled his hair, and the smell of fresh flowers filled the air. Zhao took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The clothes he wore were different, expensive, tailored, and clearly designed for someone who lived a life far beyond his means. The kind of person he'd only ever seen on television. Before him stood a figure, a woman, watching him with a bemused expression. She was tall, stunningly beautiful, dressed in a designer gown that shimmered in the fading sunlight. Welcome back, darling, the woman said, her voice smooth and confident. I hope you're feeling rested. The gala is tonight, and we have so much to do before then. Zhao's mind was reeling. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Who was this woman? Why did she call him darling? What was going on? But then, without warning, it all clicked. He wasn't Zhao Ming anymore. He was someone else entirely. The woman's face softened with a playful smile. You always get this way when you wake up in someone else's life. Don't worry, we've got plenty of time to figure everything out. He looked down at his hands, perfectly manicured, slender, and foreign. His reflection shimmered in the glass before him, a beautiful, confident woman staring back. It was as if he had stepped into the life of a celebrity. A pop star, maybe? He wasn't sure. The woman's presence, the confidence, the aura, was something he had never experienced before. He glanced around in a daze. The luxury of the penthouse, the staff bustling around him, the exotic artwork on the walls, all of it was so far removed from his own world that it felt like a dream. Who am I? He asked the woman, his voice trembling. The woman chuckled softly. You know who you are, honey. You're me, Lu Chen, remember? Lu Chen. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't place it. Who was Lu Chen? What was this life? Was it a dream? No, it felt too real, but just as quickly as the confusion came, it faded. He found himself thinking about how comfortable he felt in this new skin. The luxury. The beauty. The power. Everything was so effortless, and then, an odd sensation washed over him. A slight dizziness, a sinking feeling in his chest. He felt different. Tired, maybe? The world around him spun, and for a second, his vision blurred. But the moment passed, and his thoughts returned to Lu Chen's life, to this extraordinary new world. The next moments were a blur of glamour, parties, and endless excitement. Zhao, now Lu Chen, lived a life he had only ever dreamed about. He danced with movie stars, charmed powerful business tycoons, and wore designer outfits that made him feel like he was someone important. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. But then, something strange began to happen. When he returned to his original body, his real body, he was shocked to find that he looked older. His skin had a certain dullness to it, and there were faint lines around his eyes. He felt fatigued, like he'd just run a marathon. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. At first, he dismissed it. Stress, he told himself. It's just the stress of the day. It's nothing. But over the next few days, the changes became harder to ignore. His body seemed to age before his eyes. His hair started thinning, his skin sagged, and his joints ached as if he were decades older than he should be. Zhao stared at his reflection in horror. What was happening to him? Then, he realized, every time he swapped souls, his own body was deteriorating. His life was slowly slipping away, minute by minute, as he lived the lives of others. Zhao stood in front of the mirror, examining his reflection with a sense of dread. His face was gaunt, his skin sallow. His eyes, once sharp and youthful, now looked tired, almost hollow. The changes were subtle at first, but they were unmistakable. Each time he swapped souls, each new life he experienced, his body seemed to shrink, as if the years were being siphoned away. The sensation was disorienting. His body, which had always been his most reliable possession, was betraying him. He hadn't noticed it at first, lost in the thrill of Lu Chen's world, the power, the influence, the wealth. But now, standing here, looking at his older, worn face, he could see the cost of his choices. There was no denying it. Every time he lived another person's life, his own was slipping further and further away. It didn't make sense. He had never believed in supernatural things. He wasn't some naive fool who thought he could get something for nothing. Yet, here he was, caught in the grip of an inexplicable force. An app on his phone, a mysterious link, and now this absurd power to swap souls, to trade his own life for another's. But there was something deeper, something darker lurking under the surface. He had tried to dismiss it, convinced it was just stress or a side effect of his wild new experiences, but the more he used the power, the more he felt his own soul fragmenting. The edges of his identity, his essence, began to blur. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly himself. The worst part? He wanted more. It was intoxicating, the way each new life made him forget the mundane, forget the loneliness, the frustration that had defined his existence for so long. In Lu Chen's body, he was admired, desired, envied. People looked at him as though he were something extraordinary. But every time he returned to his own form, every time he looked in the mirror, it became harder to remember why he was willing to pay such a price. Zhao had been hoping the changes would reverse themselves, that perhaps with time, his body would return to normal. But nothing had changed. His skin still sagged, his hair still thinned. Even his muscles seemed to have lost their tone, as though his very strength was being drained away with each swap. It wasn't just the physical decay that unnerved him. It was the feeling of being split in two. His mind, once sharp and focused, had become scattered. Each new life he lived, the pop star's life, the mogul's life, the model's, left pieces of itself behind. He'd thought they were temporary escapes, thrilling distractions. But now, he realized they were eating away at him. Bit by bit, the life he once knew, the memories he had, were slipping through his fingers like sand. He sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, staring at the phone in his hands. The SoulSwap app was still there, glowing softly, beckoning him. He could feel the temptation, the lure, pulsing through him. One more swap, just one more life. What was the harm? What could it hurt? He'd only used the app a handful of times. Surely it couldn't be that bad. Could it? A buzz on his phone interrupted his thoughts. It was a notification from the app, a message from the system. Warning, each soul exchange carries a risk. The price of immortality is steep. You are nearing the threshold. Zhao blinked, rereading the message. It was cryptic, unsettling, but also strangely familiar. Immortality? He thought. There was no immortality here, not really. The app had never promised him eternal youth, only a fleeting taste of someone else's life. But the warning, it sent a chill down his spine. The price was steep. He knew that. He could feel it in his bones. He opened the app anyway. This time, he wasn't even sure what he was looking for. A life to escape to? A new identity to slip into? Or was it something darker, an impulse to feed his ego, to continue living in ways he never could before? The power to be anyone, to feel anything. Who could resist that? Zhao scrolled through the profiles. Each one was a tantalizing portrait of someone else's existence, someone richer, more beautiful, more successful than he could ever imagine. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the selection. He thought about his aging body, his deteriorating health, the fragments of his memories that no longer made sense. The thought of swapping again, of shedding this husk of a life, was almost too tempting to resist. And then, his eyes landed on a new profile. It wasn't one of the glamorous lives he'd seen before. No, this one was different. The person on the screen was a middle-aged man, unremarkable in appearance but with a name that stood out, Wang Lei, a businessman. Zhao didn't recognize him, but the idea of stepping into the life of a powerful mogul sparked something inside him. Maybe it'll be different this time, he thought. Maybe this one will be worth it. He clicked on the profile and initiated the swap. The world blurred, and for a moment, Zhao felt himself falling. He lost track of time, of space, of himself. When his senses returned, he was in a completely different place, an office, luxurious and vast, the windows revealing the skyline of a bustling city. He could hear the clink of glasses, the murmur of voices in the distance. There was a heavy scent of expensive cologne in the air. The man in the mirror, Wang Lei, was standing before him, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a sharp suit. Zhao's reflection was no longer his own. It was a man who had everything, wealth, power, influence. He looked down at his hands, strong, capable hands. For the first time in days, he didn't feel sick. He didn't feel weak. He felt alive again, invigorated, ready to take on the world. The satisfaction was immediate, almost overwhelming. He was back in a world of power, of influence, of people who would do anything for him. Everything he had ever wanted was within his reach, but the feeling didn't last long. As Zhao, now Wang Lei, began to settle into the new life, something felt wrong. He didn't know this life, didn't know the people surrounding him, and worse, his mind kept slipping, as though the memories of his past lives were crowding into his thoughts. He couldn't focus on anything, couldn't fully experience the richness of his new existence. His mind was fractured, his sense of self splintered by the constant swapping, and then it happened again. That sinking feeling in his chest, the sense that something was draining from him. He couldn't explain it, but every time he traded his soul for another, his own life, his own essence, seemed to evaporate. And now, in this powerful body, it was happening faster than ever. Zhao looked at himself in the mirror again, and the truth hit him with a brutal force. Wang Lei's reflection was fading, as if it, too, were a mask. The person staring back at him was no longer anyone, neither Wang Lei nor Zhao Ming. He was nothing but a hollow shell, a patchwork of stolen identities and forgotten selves. There was nothing left of the person he had been. His body trembled, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. What had he become? What had he done? And then, as if to answer his question, the app sent another notification: warning, your soul is nearing depletion. One more exchange will be irreversible. Zhao's heart raced. His soul was fading. His identity was gone. He had traded his life away, piece by piece, and now he had no way of getting it back. He stumbled backward from the mirror, grasping at the edges of his fading consciousness. He wanted to scream, to beg for it all to stop. But it was too late. He had made his choice. The price of his soul had been paid in full. Zhao's knees buckled. The room spun around him like a kaleidoscope of disjointed lives, faces that weren't his own, voices that belonged to people he could no longer remember. For a moment, he thought he might fall into unconsciousness, as though the weight of all those stolen identities had finally crushed him. But he caught himself, stumbling toward the desk, his hands shaking as he reached out to steady himself against the polished wood. He had no idea who Wang Lei was, or who he had been before this body. But the fear, raw, visceral, and suffocating, was unmistakable. He felt it deep in his chest, gnawing at him. The life he had chosen was collapsing around him, and there was no escape. Not anymore. I have to stop, he thought, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I have to end it. But there was no way back now, no way to undo the damage he had done. Every time he swapped souls, he had left pieces of himself behind, fragments scattered across the lives he'd inhabited. He couldn't piece it all together. The more he tried, the more distant his true self became, like a dream fading in the early morning light. He closed his eyes, trying to focus, trying to remember what it felt like to be Zhao Ming. He couldn't recall his own face anymore, his own voice. It was like watching a stranger through the fog, a distant memory that didn't belong to him. His real life was slipping away, buried under the weight of all those other lives he had briefly worn like costumes. And then, a quiet ping from his phone. The notification glowed softly, drawing his attention. He had nearly forgotten the app, but now it called to him again, like a siren in the night. You've reached the final threshold. Proceed or lose everything. Zhao's heart raced, his mind fogged by the years of borrowed lives. He knew what this meant. If he clicked again, if he swapped one last time, there would be no turning back. His body would finally age to dust. His soul would be lost, scattered across the lives of the people he had become. He gripped the phone, staring at the screen. The temptation was maddening, overwhelming. He could feel the pull of it, the desire to escape, to be someone else again. Someone more powerful, more confident, more alive than he had ever felt before, but there was a growing sense of panic in his chest, the realization that this was the final choice. He had used this power so many times before without fully understanding the cost. Now, it was clear. He was running out of time. He was running out of himself. Do it, the voice in his head whispered. just one more time. Then you'll be free. Then you'll have everything. His finger hovered over the app icon. The world around him seemed to shrink, the light dimming as his vision blurred. He could feel the years slipping away, a steady erosion of everything he had ever known. There was nothing left of his past, nothing left of his identity. The more he thought about it, the more the idea of swapping again seemed like the only way to escape the void inside him. But then, a sharp image cut through the fog, a memory, or what remained of one. A flash of his old life, a moment when he had been truly happy. He couldn't remember the details, but he saw his own face, younger, unbroken. He remembered something simple, something true, the feeling of waking up to a day that belonged entirely to him. The feeling of being whole, even if it was fleeting. That he dropped the phone onto the desk, breathing hard, his body trembling with the force of it. The idea of swapping again, the idea of vanishing entirely, of erasing everything he had left, terrified him. And yet, a part of him, the part that had craved more, that had wanted to escape the dullness of his own life, still called out to him. He stumbled back from the desk, shaking his head as if trying to shake loose the fog that clouded his thoughts. No, he thought. I can't do it. I can't lose myself completely. But even as he made the decision to stop, to cut the thread and free himself from the app's clutches, the sensation of aging hit him again. It was subtle, at first, a slight ache in his joints, a headache behind his eyes. But then it intensified, a wave of dizziness crashing over him. His vision blurred as his body seemed to collapse inward, his bones groaning under the weight of it. He stumbled to the bathroom, desperate to see himself, to look at the person he had become. The reflection that stared back at him was no longer Zhao Ming. It was a hollow version of him, an old man whose features seemed almost alien. His skin had sagged further, his eyes dark and sunken. His hair had turned gray in patches, and his face, once sharp, had become a collection of wrinkles and lines, a testament to the years he had traded away. He wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in his throat. There was no one left inside him. Not really. The more he swapped, the more his essence had slipped through his fingers. He was a shell now, an imitation of the people he had once wanted to be. The life he had lived, his true life, had been sacrificed for a fleeting glimpse of something else, something hollow. I should have stopped, he thought, as the realization sank in like a heavy weight. I should have never. But it was too late. There was no going back now. He sank to his knees on the bathroom floor, his hands shaking as he reached out to grab onto the counter, to steady himself. His body felt foreign, his mind fractured beyond repair. He had gambled everything on the idea of living other people's lives, and now there was nothing left of him. The app's final notification popped up again on his phone, but he didn't have the strength to look at it. It didn't matter anymore. The price had been paid. His soul had been sold, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but emptiness. And then, just as everything seemed to fade to black, the thought crossed his mind, like the faintest whisper in a dream, that maybe, just maybe, there had been a way to live a life that was truly his own. But it was too late for that. In the final moments of his existence, Zhao Ming, the man he had once been, was gone. All that remained was the shell of a man who had lived 1,000 lives but had never truly lived at all.